One of the most psychologically confusing relationship dynamics emerging in modern society is what happens when narcissistic behavior becomes hidden behind the language of empowerment, healing, and modern relationship culture. Because in today's world, there are conversations happening around feminism, independence, boundaries, self-worth, and emotional safety that are incredibly important and necessary. But inside certain relationships, those same ideas can sometimes become weaponized, especially when narcissism is involved. And this is where many men find themselves completely psychologically trapped. Not because female empowerment is the problem, but because narcissistic personalities are highly adaptive. They absorb the language of the culture around them. And in modern relationships, that language often revolves around identity, empowerment, trauma, emotional validation, and personal freedom. Which means narcissistic behavior no longer always appears as obvious control. Sometimes it appears as moral superiority. Sometimes it appears as permanent victimhood. Sometimes it appears as, I'm protecting my peace. I'm setting boundaries. I'm healing. I refuse to tolerate unsafe energy. You're emotionally unsafe. You're controlling. You're toxic. You're a narcissist. And many men experiencing these dynamics slowly become psychologically dismantled. Because they genuinely care about self-reflection. They want to improve. They want accountability. They want to communicate better. Which ironically makes them more vulnerable to psychological inversion. Because narcissistic dynamics thrive where one person is willing to endlessly self-analyze. And in many modern relationships, men are increasingly being taught that emotional accountability means constantly questioning themselves. Again, healthy accountability is important. But narcissistic relationships distort accountability into permanent guilt. That's the difference. The man slowly becomes responsible not only for his behavior, but for her emotions, reactions, triggers, insecurities, and emotional state entirely. And eventually the relationship stops functioning like a partnership and starts functioning like emotional surveillance. Everything becomes monitored. Tone, words, facial expressions, energy, timing, emotional reactions. And after enough emotional pressure, the nervous system eventually begins reacting. The man becomes frustrated, defensive, exhausted, emotionally dysregulated, hypervigilant. And this is where the inversion becomes devastating. Because now his reactions become the evidence used against him. Not the years of emotional destabilization beforehand. Just the reactions. And modern relationship culture often unintentionally reinforces this dynamic. Because society has become increasingly focused on emotional harm, validation, and psychological language. Again, many of these developments are positive. But narcissists adapt extremely well to emotionally moral language. Especially covert female narcissists. Because covert narcissism functions heavily through image management and victim positioning. It is less about domination through force, and more about domination through emotional framing. Now suddenly every disagreement becomes psychological diagnosis. If the man defends himself, he's defensive. If he becomes frustrated, he's emotionally unsafe. If he explains his perspective, he's gaslighting. If he withdraws emotionally, he's avoidant. If he questions inconsistencies, he lacks empathy. If he reaches breaking point emotionally after years of pressure, he's abusive. And one of the most dangerous aspects of this dynamic is that many men do not realize they are being psychologically conditioned until very late. Because the relationship often begins with intense emotional connection, admiration, validation, affection, emotional intimacy. The man feels deeply seen. But slowly, the emotional atmosphere changes. The relationship becomes increasingly centered around her emotional reality, her triggers, her wounds, her boundaries, her healing, her unhappiness. And eventually the man starts disappearing psychologically inside the relationship. His emotional needs become secondary. then burdensome, then selfish, then evidence of emotional immaturity. And because modern culture increasingly frames emotional sensitivity as moral authority, many men stop trusting their own emotional experience entirely. They begin assuming, if she feels hurt, I must have done something wrong. That belief becomes incredibly dangerous inside narcissistic dynamics, because narcissists experience emotional discomfort very intensely. But emotional discomfort is not always evidence of mistreatment. Sometimes it is simply frustration at not controlling the emotional environment fully. And narcissists often struggle profoundly with emotional accountability because accountability threatens identity. So blame gets externalized constantly. This is why projection becomes such a dominant feature in these relationships. The narcissistic partner projects their own behaviors onto the other person. Control becomes, you're controlling. Manipulation becomes, you manipulate me emotionally. Lack of empathy becomes, you never emotionally support me. Meanwhile, the man often spends years trying desperately to fix problems that continuously recreate themselves. That's one of the defining characteristics of narcissistic relationships. Resolution never truly arrives. Because the instability itself serves psychological function, the relationship remains emotionally centered around the narcissist's needs, emotions, and identity. And over time, the man's nervous system starts deteriorating under the constant pressure. This is where many men become deeply confused psychologically, because by the later stages of the relationship, they genuinely do become emotionally reactive. They may yell, become defensive, shut down emotionally, obsessively try to explain themselves, become anxious during conflict. And the narcissist often points directly at those reactions as proof that he is the unstable one. This dynamic is known psychologically as reactive abuse. Prolonged emotional destabilization eventually creates emotional reactions, which are then reframed as the original problem. And because modern relationship discourse increasingly emphasizes emotional safety and psychological language, these accusations carry enormous weight, especially in therapy. This is where many men experience one of the most psychologically devastating moments of the entire relationship. The female narcissist enters therapy and emerges further validated. Now suddenly the relationship is being interpreted almost entirely through her emotional framing. The therapist sees a hurt woman, an emotionally expressive woman, a traumatized woman, a woman describing emotional pain. Meanwhile, the man arrives exhausted, emotionally dysregulated and defensive from years of psychological pressure. Guess who appears unstable? Him. Because trauma rarely looks calm. Especially male trauma. Male trauma often looks like frustration, withdrawal, anger, emotional shutdown, irritability. Not because men feel less deeply, but because many men were never taught safe emotional processing to begin with. And narcissistic dynamics exploit that heavily. Now the man begins questioning his entire identity. What if I really am toxic? What if I am emotionally abusive? What if I actually am the narcissist? And because empathetic men self-reflect deeply, they spiral into endless self-analysis. Meanwhile, the narcissist often appears increasingly emotionally enlightened through therapeutic language. That's another major issue in modern narcissistic relationships. Therapy language becomes weaponized. Boundaries, triggers, emotional labor, attachment wounds, nervous system safety, healing. These concepts are real and valuable psychologically. But narcissists use them selectively, not for mutual growth, for narrative control. Now selfishness becomes self-care, control becomes boundaries, emotional punishment becomes protecting peace, lack of accountability becomes healing, and many men become trapped inside endless psychological defense trying to prove they are not who they are being framed as. That process destroys self-trust. Because gaslighting does not simply distort events. It distorts internal certainty itself. The man stops trusting his memory, his instincts, his perception, his emotional reality. Everything becomes questionable. And eventually many men begin emotionally abandoning themselves in order to preserve the relationship. That is one of the clearest indicators of narcissistic abuse. A relationship where one person slowly disappears psychologically while trying to maintain emotional stability for the other. Now, none of this means women are the problem. And it does not mean feminism itself is the problem. Healthy feminism values mutual respect, accountability, equality, and emotional responsibility from both people. But narcissism can wear any ideology as camouflage. Political ideology, spirituality, therapy culture, feminism, victimhood, empathy. Narcissists adapt to whichever social language provides the greatest moral protection. And in modern relationships, emotional victimhood often carries enormous social power, which means male victims of covert narcissistic abuse frequently remain unseen, especially if their trauma eventually becomes emotionally visible. Because society often struggles to recognize emotionally exhausted men as victims. Instead, their reactions become the focus, not the years of emotional erosion underneath them. And this is why so many men remain trapped in confusion for years after these relationships end. Not because they are weak, because psychological inversion destroys internal grounding, especially when the narcissist successfully controls the narrative socially. Family, friends, therapists, social media. Everything becomes filtered through the narcissist's emotional framing. And eventually the man realizes something painful. No amount of explaining will make somebody understand a dynamic they are emotionally unwilling to see. That becomes the turning point in healing. Because healing after narcissistic abuse is not about winning. It is about rebuilding relationship with reality again. Rebuilding self-trust. Rebuilding emotional grounding. Rebuilding nervous system safety. Learning again that emotional reactions under prolonged pressure do not automatically define identity. Learning the difference between accountability and psychological submission. And perhaps most importantly, learning that healthy love does not require somebody to continuously abandon themselves in order to preserve another person's emotional comfort. Because real relationships require accountability from both people, not permanent emotional guilt from one, and permanent emotional exemption from the other.